Welcome to A Dram of Outlander. This is Desiree, your podcaster and the writer for ADramOfOutlander.com. For all things Outlander, from the Dine to Gabaldon book series to the Stars TV series and anything interesting that falls between. This is podcast episode 169 and week 5 of the Fiery Cross read-along. We are covering chapters 7 and 8, Shrapnel and the Factor. So these two chapters, all in all, I like to think of them as some fluff. This is part of why the gathering is so incredibly long in the books. I mean, this is the longest day ever. We're now into chapters 7 and 8, and the day is only partway done, and we're looking at the latest, midday. All right, and the summary goes something like this. Claire greets an unexpected patient. Ghosts of Culloden emerge with 25-year-old Shrapnel. Jemmy is given orders. We meet an important pair. Roger questions his place in the family. A baby must eat, after all. The MacKenzies of Leoch live on. Roger goes from zero to hero. So we are still at the gathering. Late October 1770, with cool, gray, and wet weather at Mount Helicon, North Carolina, which is Grandfather Mountain. So who are the active characters here? Claire is working her pop-up clinic. Lieutenant Archie Hayes comes to get Shrapnel from Culloden removed after hearing how amazing Claire is through Farquard Campbell. Jemmy. He shows up at the end of the clinic visit and also talks to Roger. Duncan, Innes, and the new characters of the Bugs, Arch and Murdina. Okay, those are the people we basically see here. This could have been done in much shorter. It gives texture to the reading and gives us a really good visual representation of what's going on. I don't know why Diana wrote it to be this day as being so incredibly long. I mean, they had to have been up at 4 a.m., 5 a.m., and we're maybe only 6-7 hours into the day. I mean, wow. That's pretty wild that they've done so much in these mere few hours. The TV show, this is all going to be so truncated. It is not necessary. One of the things that Riche posted on the Dram of Outlander group on Facebook this week is the picture of an iceberg. And on the top it says movie, and then you see 2/3 to 3/4 of this iceberg below the water, and that's the book. I think that picture absolutely gives us that representation of what Outlander TV show versus Outlander book series is really like. Because in the TV show, they have to scale back and give us the bare bones, important storylines. That's how they see it. And that's how they're offering it to us. So when we look at it that way, it makes a lot of sense that this is going to be pared back, really, really hard pared back. So we'll probably see the very key characters that keep showing up, but it's all going to be truncated massively, is my guess. Otherwise, it would not make for good viewing. I mean, following them around since the sun rose, or right before a sunrise, all throughout their day with all these things going on, the detail really isn't important, but the characters will be introduced and the conversations might be had. However, as we get through this podcast, looking at some of the information, I don't even know if it's going to be applicable. Because in the book, as we're going to see, and it's going to be reinforced here, Jemmy does not have hardly any memory of Culloden in the series. We don't, in the book series, I mean. So What does he know in the TV show? It seems like he has more memory than in the books. But I guess we'll find out how they're going to let that play out. All right. So what is of note here? So Lieutenant Archie Hayes, who's the regimental leader, who came and brought his Highland regiment, and they will be shipping out as soon as possible. They were delayed going back to England to be disbanded, or Scotland to be disbanded. And he was the one who talked about the Hillsborough riot and wanted people to come and turn other people in who participated in that. Okay, this is still the same friggin' day going on here. Doesn't it seem like so long ago? All right. So how old was Hayes at Culloden? As Claire is looking at his shirtless frame, he has gunpowder beneath his skin, and his skin looks dark and mottled, and he has lots of scarring around one of his nipples. Like, he is definitely been war tested, right? And we learn that the little piece of shrapnel, a bullet had busted, was still in his body, but it had worked its way toward his skin and was causing him problems. I did put some links at the bottom of the written post about shrapnel, war wounds, etc. I found some interesting articles, but I couldn't post them because they were through like the Journal of American Medicine, and you have to have a membership, that kind of thing. And it wouldn't help you guys at all if that was the case. So I did put some links in at the end talking about shrapnel. But so he's had this gunpowder beneath his skin, and it was not so fine as it is now. And a piece of a bullet. And I also put in the links about the guns that were used during the Culloden battle, because there was kind of a shorter shotgun as well as a musket. And so I put links in there if you're interested in going to look. It's pretty fascinating. I sat and read about it for about an hour today. I was like, oh. And I also put some links in about myths about Culloden that surprised me. And I've walked Culloden battlefield, and I've gone through the entire new visitor center just about 4 years ago. And somehow I missed some of this. So the representations that we read about, by and large, seem to be wrong. And I found 2 different sources that said that. So there you have it. I think you'll be shocked when you read it. I'll get into more of that later, though. So Hayes was 11 years old at Culloden, like I said, and Jemmy saved him when one of the Murchison brothers, the twins, shot him at point-blank range. Wow. That is pretty incredible to be so young on the field. And he's been carrying around this gunpowder, and he's been carrying around the shrapnel for 25 years. That is completely wild. So as Claire is treating Hayes, Jemmy comes up, and he says, Sergeant Murchison is dead. And this causes Hayes to smile at Jemmy. And he calls him Red Jemmy in Gaelic, Seamus Rua. And he says back to Jemmy, I did think you might come to your wife sooner or later. I've been seeking you the morn. Yeah, he's been looking for him for hours. And here's what the text says. I was startled at the name, and so was Jemmy. A look of surprise flashed across his features, then disappeared, replaced by wariness. No one had called him Red Jemmy since the days of the Rising. I heard, he said dryly. He sat down in my extra stool, facing Hayes. Let's have it then. What is it? Hayes pulled up the sporran that dangled between his knees, rummaged for a moment, and pulled out a square folded paper, secured with a red wax seal marked with a crest I recognized. My heart skipped a beat at the sight. I somehow doubted that Governor Tryon was sending me a belated birthday wish. Oh, Claire, she's so funny. So we get into this conversation between Jemmy and Hayes, and they start talking. And Jemmy wants to know why he's here. Hayes thinks that Jemmy's a bit suspicious in his old age. And Jemmy says, "That's how I've lived to grow as old as I have." Smiling slightly. I love the delicate humor sometimes that we see. Now, this is where we get into sort of the meat of the revelation that Jemmy doesn't remember hardly anything. And he doesn't talk about it much because he doesn't want to remember anything. And he says, "You say it was a man named Murchison who shot you on the field of Dramosi?" I had finished the bandaging. Hayes moved his shoulder experimentally, testing for pain. "Why, you kent that surely, Seamus Raw. Do you not recall the day, man?" Jemmy's face changed subtly, and I felt a small tremor of unease. The fact was that Jemmy had almost no memory of the day of the clans at the slaughter that had left so many bleeding in the rain, him among them. I knew that small scenes from that day came back to him now and again in his sleep, fragments of nightmare, but whether it was from trauma, injury, or simple force of will, the Battle of Culloden was lost to him, or had been, until now. I didn't think he wanted it back. "A great deal happened then," he said. "I didn't remember everything, no." And then Hayes says in reply, "Your husband's a modest man, Mistress Fraser. Has he never told you what he did that day?" "There was a good bit of gallantry on that field," Jemmy muttered, head bent over the letter, "and quite a bit of the reverse." I didn't think he was reading. His eyes were fixed, as though he were seeing something else beyond the paper that he held. "Aye, there was. But it does seem worth remark when a man's saved your life, no?" This startles Jemmy. He looks up. "You do not recall how you struck Murchison across the head, just as he was set to bayonet me on the ground? And then you picked me up and carried me from the field, awa to a bitty well nearby. One of the chiefs lay in the grass there, and his men were bathing his head in the water, but I could see he was dead. He lay so still. There was someone there to tend me. They wished you to stay too, for you were wounded and bleeding, but you would not. You wished me well in the name of St. Michael, and I went back then to the field. You looked fair wild, man. There was blood running down your face, and your hair was loose on the wind. You'd sheathed your sword to carry me, but you pulled it again as you turned away. I did not think I should see you again, for if I ever saw a man set to meet his death—" He shook his head, his eyes half closed, as though he saw not the sober, stalwart man before him, not the Fraser of Fraser's Ridge, but Red Jemmy, the young warrior who had not gone back from gallantry, but because he sought to throw his life away, feeling it a burden, because he had lost me. "Did I?" Jemmy muttered. "I had forgotten." I could feel the tension in him, singing like a stretched wire under my hand, a pulse beat quick in the artery beneath his ear. There were things he had forgotten, but not that. Neither had I. So Jemmy confirms that Murchison is dead. Well, the new Murchison as well. So Jemmy is still very tense about Culloden. And we get a little more insight into Book Jemmy, kind of what makes him tick, what he's buried. And Claire is very reticent to bring it up. She doesn't ask about it. She figures if he's going to talk about it, he will. And she's been on battlefields herself. She knows what it is. She knows how devastating it is, how hard it is, the trauma that goes with it. And she's not about to bring it up. I suspect that Claire probably has a little bit of her own trauma from being a field nurse during World War II and seeing what she saw. So she's very sensitive to the fact that Jamie definitely has this trauma. The surprise of Hayes that Jamie really doesn't remember. It makes me wonder if Jamie's going to have more recurrent nightmares coming up, because now he has this little insight that will be nagging at him. And as Hayes leaves, he gives Jamie a blessing, and may blessed Michael defend you. And then Claire does ask him, how much do you remember? And Jamie says, almost nothing, and that is still too much. And then we get from the shock of going down Culloden memory lane to what was in the letter that Hayes handed Jamie from his spore, and it was from Governor Tryon. New Bern, 20 October. Colonel James Fraser, whereas the peace and good order of this government has been lately violated and much injury done to the persons and properties of many inhabitants of this province by a body of people who style themselves regulators, I do, by the advice of His Majesty's Council, order and direct you forthwith to call a general muster of so many men as you judge suitable to serve in a regiment of militia, and make report to me as soon as possible of the number of volunteers that are willing to turn out in the service of their king and country when called upon, and also what number of effective men belong to your regiment who can be ordered just in case of an emergency, and in case of further violence should be attempted to be committed by the insurgents. Your diligent and punctual obedience to these orders will be received by your obedient servant, William Tryon. That was a mouthful. That was only a couple sentences. Talk about lack of punctuation and run-on. And really, the accent of that day would sound pretty similar to the southern accent of the region. It would not be as Queen's English. And it's very interesting how finally it dawned on me last podcast that Claire would sound very, very distinct. She would not sound English at all. That is fascinating. We have to suspend disbelief, knowing that the language has changed over the last 200 years, and that English accent that we all think of as English is not what it would have sounded like then. And that ends this chapter. So that gives us good detail in the background of Culloden, and it really gives us a framework for Archie Hayes. I wonder if we'll see him again. And it spells out what Jamie's to do with the militia, right? So in the TV show, Jamie already got the letter to form a militia to go after Murta. So will there be a conversation between Hayes and Jamie? This is probably not even necessary in the show. It'll probably have nothing to do with the gathering. I don't know. We may not even meet Hayes. Go figure. Okay. Chapter 8 is called The Factor. A factor is somebody who takes care of something for you while you are away. Runs your business. They have all the rights to do whatever they need to do while you're gone. So we will be meeting the factor in this chapter. So we see Roger leaving Jocasta's tent, and he's trying to get to their campsite, and he's talking to people along the way, and he's thinking there'll be a next time. He's still kind of spinning from that conversation he had with Brianna about birth control, the safety of childbearing, etc., and the challenges that it has, as well as the fact that she said they'll have another child. There'll be a next time. That is sitting with him. And that's a big deal, especially not knowing whether or not Jemmy is biologically his. And in a time where biology matters more than now, and it still matters a lot to people, mind you, I mean, I know people who will go to the most extreme scenarios in order to have their own biological child instead of adopting a child. It still happens. And now that we have all this additional reproductive technology, it is incredible. And I have great ethical thoughts and beliefs surrounding all this technology, which I will not get into here. Okay, so Roger's minding his own business, and he runs into a very dashing-looking Duncan Innes, who is looking for him, and they come face to face. And Duncan introduces some new people. And one of the lines that Duncan uses in the beginning of this conversation is, "Happy the corpse the rain falls on." So we've already gone through that little bit of writing earlier when a chapter was titled such. So we get to see and meet Mr. Bug. And Duncan introduces Roger as himself's good son, Roger Mac. Him I telt you of. Now, Duncan Innes had been a fisherman, so this is a lot different what his life is like now. So it's Arch Bug. He's a tall, thin, bony man, quite a bit older, and he's very austere. And then we hear, out of nowhere, his small, plump wife, Murdina Bug. We don't get her first name here, but that is her first name. And she's a chatty Cathy. She is one who is an extrovert among extroverts. Like, she's at the top of the extrovert heap. And she likes to stream of consciousness speak. So here's a little taste of Murdina Bug. "It's that kind, sir, of Mr. Fraser, and I'm sure as he'll have any reason to regret it. Indeed he'll not, as I said to him myself. I cannot tell you what a blessing it is, and us not sure where our next bite was coming from, or how to keep a roof above our heads. I said to Arch, I said, now, we must just trust in Christ and Our Lady, and if we none starve, we shall do it in a state of grace. And Arch, he says to me..." That is what she does. She just... stream of consciousness, baby. Mistress Bug. And she keeps talking. During this conversation, she keeps talking. And she looks at Roger and extroverts all over him in a good way. Okay? But first, we find that Archbug is going to be the new factor for the Ridge. And this sets off a whole cascade of thoughts for Roger. He is still not comfortable in his skin in the 18th century and his abilities. Mrs. Bug decides to, take charge and clean up Roger's messed up coat because he and, Bree took a roll in the leaves. And it's actually Jamie's coat. But we get this internal dialogue of Roger. The kind of dialogue we often see with Claire. Roger is upset and allows his mind to reel when he thinks Jamie thinks poorly of him, and his thoughts lead to all sorts of insecurities about his abilities in this time. And eventually he comes to the conclusion that Jamie must think he's a hopeless numpty. He's a hopeless idiot. And it's very upsetting to him because he thinks that he's going to be taught the skills required to take care of business on the Ridge, and he'll be Jamie's second as his son-in-law. And he has all these things swirling in his head. Poor Roger. It's like he thinks he's failed the interview. And that Jamie doesn't really like him and thinks he can't do a damn thing. Well, he really can't do a damn thing. He doesn't have good management skills. Brianna has those. He doesn't hunt. And he can learn. He doesn't know how to build things. He can learn. So every skill that's required in the 18th century, Roger really can't do. He's a singer. He plays a bowrin. And he's a historian. Well, none of those things, like him writing papers or giving lectures, is really not beneficial to life in the mountains of North Carolina in the 18th century. So he's having all this run through, but I can learn. I can do it. Yeah, you can do it, Roger. Eventually you'll figure it all out. But he hasn't been part of the family very long. It's only been a mere few months that he and Brianna have been back together. And they're a family. I mean, most of the time in the 18th, Roger spent away from Brianna and with the Mohawk. So it's just, there's a lot of integration that has to go on, and he hasn't had a lot of time to really learn these skills. And during the time at the Ridge, they had to leave not too long after they were there to come to the gathering. So he has a huge learning curve, way more than Brianna, because Frank prepared Brianna for life in the 18th century. Like, she really shouldn't have known how to hunt and shoot and track and do all the things that she knows how to do. But he prepared her, even though she was a Boston girl. So we're kind of getting in some backstory on the Bugs. And they've been together for 40 years. Archbug had worked for Malcolm Grant of Glenmoriston. But after Culloden, it was impossible. And then they tried to make do as a crofter. And then they decided to seek life in America. And here you have it. They've been found. Ha-ha. But apparently, Duncan believes that Archbug has the best skills possible that are necessary for running the Ridge in the event that Jamie's not there. So he's going to oversee the whole thing, all the tenants, etc. And Roger is just spiraling in his head. Like, Fergus has one hand, and even though he knows how to read, he doesn't grasp numbers very well. And Mr. Bug's hand, well, he's missing some fingers, and he has bad arthritis. And here's Roger's thought. So Jamie thought that even an elderly, half-crippled man would be better equipped than Roger to handle the affairs of Fraser's Ridge. That was an unexpectedly bitter thought. And he goes further to think he knew his father-in-law had doubts of his ability beyond any father's natural mistrust of the man betting his daughter. Totally tone-deaf himself, Jamie would naturally not value Roger's musical gift. And while Roger was decently sized and hard-working, it was unfortunately true that he had little practical knowledge of animal husbandry, hunting, or the use of deadly weapons. And granted, he had no great experience in farming or in running a large estate, which Mr. Bug plainly did. So, damn it, he thinks that he should really have been rewarded with this position. All right. So it's very cute when Mrs. Bug totally takes charge of Roger's messed up coat. Sit you down, young man, and I'll attend to this fine barrage. Mrs. Bug interrupted these dark musings. She pulled on his sleeve, making clicking noises of disapproval as she viewed the leaves and twigs in his hair. Look at you, all glothered and blashed about. Fighting, was it? Och, well. I hope the other fellow looks worse. That's all I can say. Before he could protest, she had him seated on a rock, had whipped a wooden comb from her pocket and the thong from his hair, and was dealing with his disordered locks in a brisk manner that felt calculated to rip several strands from his scalp. And so she's just talking and talking about his singing and that he was the one with the beautiful voice and playing the drum. Oh. And she doesn't stop as she's administering to Roger. Jamie comes upon them with a very unhappy baby, Jemmy, who is hungry, and he's been looking for Brianna. And Mrs. Bug says, "What a sweet laddie." Roger would not think the baby is sweet at all. Berserk! The baby was bright red in the face, the tracks of tears staining his cheeks, and he sucked furiously on the sustaining thumb, eyes squashed shut in an effort to escape a patiently unsatisfactorily world. what hair he had was sticking up in sweaty spikes and whorls. He had come out of his wrappings, which hung in disreputable folds and draggles. He also smelled like a neglected privy for reasons which were all too obvious. So, they don't know where Brianna is, and Mrs. Bug decides, after they think perhaps Marsali should be feeding the baby because they can't find Brianna. Brianna didn't like anybody else feeding him. However, you go find the milk where the milk is. And Marsali has her own baby, and so it would be fine if she nursed Jemmy. And in that situation, Brianna would just have to hand express in order to get comfort back to her breasts and not get a clogged ducts or mastitis, missing a feeding. I did put a link in about what it was like for breastfeeding mothers in the 18th century. I think you'll find that a really fascinating read. It was not a big deal. Nobody worried about seeing women breastfeeding their babies. Sometimes women had to nurse another woman's baby. It was like not an issue. It didn't become an issue in the United States until the advent of formula, really. And then all of these marketing maneuvers created a very problematic environment for breastfeeding mothers because it was seen as poor and dirty and immodest and all sorts of other things. And we're still climbing out of that 100+ years later of that, those sort of ideas and thoughts, and back to just breastfeeding as the biological norm. So I thought some of you would find it interesting to look that up. And as Mrs. Bug is fawning over the baby, Roger's insecurity increases when she mentions how the baby will grow to be like him. So, first of all, I think that Jemmy is casting him aside and not giving him his due as the first son, really, and giving him responsibilities as his second. And then he thinks, oh, like the baby's not even his. So that just stabs him a little bit more. So the poor guy is having a massive crisis in the middle of all of this going on. The other thing that we learn that is super interesting is when they ask where Roger's from, his family. And of course they can't verify it. But Jemmy says the MacKenzies of Leoch, like Jemmy himself. And we learn that the MacKenzies of Leoch actually survived. They got onto a ship with the laird, Hamish MacCallum. He was actually Dougal's son, but maybe only a few people in the world knew that. And they ended up going to Canada. Very interesting. So Hamish survived. I wonder if we're going to see any of the MacKenzies of Leoch in the future. But now Jemmy actually has family. He's not alone in the colonies, as it were. Well, they think they went to Acadia, to Canada. Could have been to Nova Scotia, maybe to Maine, to an island. They don't really know. But they survived, so they're either in the colonies or Canada. And at this point, Duncan takes the bugs to go meet Claire. Oh, Claire's going to love Murdina. And they kind of wander off, leaving Jemmy and Roger together. And Jemmy explains the piece of paper that he received and talks to him about the militia. It's going to be interesting to see how Roger's integrated into this, because in the show, Roger comes back to River Run. Jemmy gets that letter, but it's months premature. Months and months and months premature. So how is Roger going to be integrated into this? before he and Jemmy even have a relationship. So that is going to be a fascinating process of how they're going to fast track how Jemmy and Roger get along, because they're still in the foundational processes months later in the book. So how are they going to kind of engineer that to be believable? Or is Roger not going to participate and not be Captain MacKenzie? We'll see. We will just have to see, because that was part of the issue. It wasn't all the little detail that was missing. It was the character development and the relationship developments that, even though the writers in season 4 really tried to focus on that, it was still haphazard. I really wish they would keep a team of writers that would really know the characters that they're writing and leave it at that. And switching out writers constantly is just not, I don't think it'd do great. I mean, do they know the characters? Do they have a handle on them? They're going to put their own spin, and it doesn't make sense on how they're developing them. So I think that relationally, there really is going to have to be somehow, they're going to have to make peace and fast track it well. But at the point in the TV show when he returns to River Run and the letter comes from Tryon, they haven't even had a chance to say hello to each other after his return. So who knows? So maybe in the process of forming the militia, finding the men, we don't even know who's on the ridge. I'm shrugging my shoulders right now. I don't know how that's going to be overcome in the show. So they have this conversation, and Jemmy is really bringing Roger in and talking to him about the talk around the fires and the fist fight at the Cabers, and the Hillsborough riots really did bring all of this to the surface. And with Archie Hayes showing up and wanting people to come and turn people in, it's a lot. It's a lot. So now Jemmy is holding the bag. This is the payment he has to make to the devil because he took that land. And Jemmy says it was luck that they came across Archbug and his wife, because Claire will go and ride with them. And doesn't want to leave Brianna to manage on her own. And now Roger finally gets it after all his angstiness. He says, "On her own? You mean, you want me to come to help raise man for the militia?" And Jemmy gave him a puzzled look. Aye, who else? He pulled the edges of his plaid higher about his shoulders, hunched against the rising wind. "Come along then, Captain MacKenzie," he said, a wry note in his voice. "We've work to do before you're wed." That's the end of this chapter. So there's a lot of building in here, and we really get a view into Roger's brain, what he's thinking, the processes that he's really going through, which we saw with Brianna much more when she was without him, and how she had to function and make do in that pregnancy and processing everything. And we're now getting to see Roger being able to deal with the realities of where they live, because Brianna became much more integrated than he did, because he was at the Mohawk Village a lot of the time, being tormented and not sure he was going to get back. So it's all very surprising to Roger what is happening. The next podcast will have chapters 9 and 10, which I think you will find to be interesting. But this is very slow moving at this point. And again, you just have to suspend disbelief. This is all one day. It is just forever and ever. They said, Meryl and Tony did say that they were doing the gathering. I know that some were saying maybe they won't do the gathering at all. Maybe it'll all just be a river run. They're doing the gathering, so I don't know what they're going to pick and choose from all of this day, but we don't need most of it, really. And I know that this is a very hard portion for a lot of readers to get through, because it is so bogged down in detail. So the other links I put in are militias of colonial North Carolina, Revolutionary War era North Carolina militias, and Culloden battlefield weapons. I started thinking, what about Murchison? What was he shot with? And it said that Murchison was going to bayonet him. So I think, okay, so what kind of guns did they have? And the one link that's myths about the Battle of Culloden, really fascinating that the Jacobites actually shot more guns, more balls than did the English, but they were far outnumbered by the Hanoverian army. But interestingly, instead of it being actually muskets over swords, meaning British muskets over Jacobite swords, it's the other way around. It's English swords over Jacobite muskets. And the other thing about that is that it wasn't the Irish seconds, thirds under the Bonnie Prince Charles that chose the field where they were. There actually was 3 other choices, and they ended up there because of the weather. And the choice that was nearby was much easier ground to be on. So please go and check out that link. It is super, super interesting. And like I said, after walking the field of Culloden and going through the visitor center myself, somehow some of this was missed. And the 7 myths that are written about, and it's in a published book, and there was another article as well that I found. So, The myth 1 was the Battle of Culloden was a dynastic conflict between the Stuarts and the Hanoverians, which it really wasn't. They were really against the Union that happened in 1707 that created or led to the creation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Next, the Battle of Culloden was fought between a modern army and the Highland clans. That's not true. The Jacobite army was very well organized. It was just not quite as big. And they were using French and British tactics, and they had a lot of artillery. The next myth is the Battle of Culloden was fought between Catholics and Protestants. Most of the Jacobites were actually Protestants. They were Episcopalians who wanted Presbyterianism disestablished in Scotland. Most of the Highlanders who fought for the Stuarts were Episcopalian too. There were a number of Catholics, but they were a minority of the army, and a small minority once the Scottish and Irish troops in the French service are excluded. Super interesting there. The Battle of Culloden was a victory of muskets over swords, but the opposite way, that's like I said. The picture that we got of Culloden, and it was really a misinformation campaign after Culloden to make the Jacobites look stupid, backwards, Highlands, strange-speaking, the Gaelic, etc., and they were really looked at as less than, and so we were able to get that picture rewritten of history on who had what weapons. So that's myth number 4 as part of that. Let's see, we already covered myth number 5, which is the choice of location. Myth 6, the Battle of Culloden was fought to end a British civil war. The Jacobite army was constructed and paid on the lines of the pre-Union Scottish army. Its officers described themselves as fighting the English, and French officers serving with the Jacobites saw matters in this light also, describing the conflict in Scotland versus English terms, as did many in England. Although many Scots fought against the Jacobites, though many less than joined them, and there were more deserters from the British army to the Jacobites than vice versa, this was equally true in wars of Wallace and Bruce and in the American and Irish wars of independence. Myth 7, the Battle of Culloden was a defeat for Scottish nationalism. It was not. It's still going on today. A Stuart Scotland would probably have been independent and have had its own army, but would likely not have had much room to pursue a separate foreign policy from London. In this sense, it would have been in a position close to that enjoyed by the British Empire's dominions such as Canada and Australia in the 19th century. So it would have been different for sure than it is now. So there you have it. I find it to be so interesting, and it's part of a book called Great Battles Culloden, and the other works by the author, who's a professor and pro-vice principal at the University of Glasgow, and he's one of the leading scholars of Jacobitism and Romanticism globally. And his other works are The Myth of the Jacobite Clans and The Invention of Scotland. So I hope you find that interesting as I do. There are lots of videos that show 18th century era Scottish weapons. You can watch videos from the Culloden Visitor Center, and you can go through and see what it was about. But now that I've kind of found these myths, it'll be interesting the next time I go back to Scotland, which I plan to at some point, hopefully sooner than later, will be to go through the exhibit of the battle with totally fresh eyes, because I had wrong notions when I went there before, and being able to see them in a new light with new information will be truly, fascinating and really change how I see it and experience it. Because when you go through the visitor center, there's the battle exhibit. You can walk through the British side and you can walk through the Jacobite side. And you can see how things unfold from both. Yeah, it's pretty hardcore to walk through it. Worth it. Totally hardcore. Okay, let's see what some of you listeners had to say. I got an email reminding me that Edmund Fanning, who we talked about in the podcast for the book, was the one that Claire operated on during the theater scene. I was like, oh yeah, that's right. So they've already had contact with Fanning in the TV show. And next is an email from Sydney, who's from Arlington, Washington. She says, hello, I was fortunate enough to stumble into the Outlander series last year. I had seen the first 1 or 2 episodes of the show previously, and it didn't grip me. Bored, I gave it another try, watched 3 to 4 episodes straight, and went and found the first book to start. In the last 10 months, I read through all the books, several of them twice already. I found your podcast at the end of last summer and listened when I couldn't be reading. I appreciate the hard work you do with both the episode breakdowns as well as the book read-throughs. In fact, I wish you had the time, energy, and passion to do podcasts on all my favorite books. Thank you, Sydney. What are your favorite books, by the way? I'm glad you're going through the Fiery Cross on the podcast. Like many others, I struggled to get through this book, and I know I skimmed through it trying to find out what happened last time. One of the things that I did not realize on my first read-through is how many real people, places, and events that Diana wove into the story. Much of my previous knowledge about revolutionary pre-revolution colonies is from New England rather than further south. I'm really grateful for you taking the time to contextualize the events and have loved taking some deep dives into history that I didn't know much about, but of course has a lot to do with how the country came together. It's true. There were things I learned about the Revolutionary War in America from these books, and it caused me to go and, wait a minute, did that happen? Who were these people? Because they weren't really taught to us when I was growing up, those many years ago. And she goes on to say, as you frequently say, the fact that the characters are both flawed and deep makes them incredibly real. I also find it interesting the way the various generations are woven together. It's granted me a lot of empathy and understanding toward the experiences of others. Really, truly awful, difficult things happen to people every day, and you never know when you're encountering someone on their toughest day. But for the sake of love and family, people manage to find strength and keep going, and I appreciate seeing how the various characters do that and still find moments of peace and happiness. I hope you have a lovely rest of your week, and thank you again. Sincerely, Sydney. Thank you, Sydney. That was a really nice email, and I appreciate you. It's true. People do have terrible things happen all the time, and we just don't know. And today, it seems like we are even more connected, but it's almost like we're peering in, like watching a fishbowl through social media and through all our interconnectedness around the world. I mean, geez, on Twitter, I have friends who are in Canada and Scotland and other places and around the U.S., and we talk, and we've become close friends. But I think that's really the rarity, and that for the most part, we get to see other people's lives, but we're really not part of it. We're really separate from it, and it's almost like watching a TV show or movies where it appears to be that we are greatly connected, that we are part and participating in a much smaller global society. But I don't know if that's necessarily true. But I do hope that we do carry empathy and concern and caring and want to make a difference. I don't know. There are so many challenges in it, though, and so many people are still just trying to survive their every single day and make their bills and raise their family and get to their job and put one foot in front of the other, that there isn't always time or capacity to reach outside of ourselves and appropriately help other people in a way that they really need, whether it's culturally, how they need it financially, how they need it educationally. It's a fine line, and we have to be really careful not to have a colonialistic attitude of we're better, or the expansionist attitude of early America post-Revolutionary War, that we're better. And because we have these things, we are superior, and we don't understand your culture, so we're superior. And it's really challenging. And I think on the day-to-day, when you see people on the street or in the store, wherever you run into people, that, yeah, you don't know if it's their worst day ever. And to simply have empathy, if at all possible, to be kind, sometimes that's the best we can do. And to be non-judgmental, because we really don't know. We don't really peer into people's lives. We just think we do through all of this intensity of social media and how the internet works. And really, it's very strange. I think for a lot of the times we'd be so much better off without it. But could we ever live without it unless the satellites fall out of the sky, right? I don't know. And we lose electricity and lose all the things, and we go backwards in time. I don't think we will live without it ever again, and it's going to increase in intensity and give us that false sense of knowing and understanding other people. So it's our job to make sure that we're not losing that, and that when we're peering into someone else's life, that we still don't presume things about them, and that we keep our kindness and respect. Okay. So yes, these chapters, though they have some building blocks, they're pretty fluffy and could have been edited down, but I still think they matter. And I love how we really get to see into Roger's head and into Jamie's discomfort. And I did a fair amount of reading on shrapnel wounds. And apparently, in modern day, when there are shrapnel wounds, that part of the protocol is to use a Geiger counter and see if there's radiation. Because when shrapnel is left behind, which a lot of it often is, unless it works its way to the surface, it just embeds in the body and ends up being encased with scar tissue in order to keep it from moving, like the body just takes care of itself. But one of the things that's really a problem with it is that shrapnel that stays within the body can lead to cancers because of the properties of whatever's in that shrapnel. So that's pretty sad, and there's a lot of it. But I did find stories and stories and stories of shrapnel coming out of someone after 65 years, from... I did not watch the videos, but there's several videos. If you feel the need to watch them, by all means do. I don't want to watch them right now. But I thank you for listening and following the podcast and going down rabbit holes with me, because to me, that's the foundation that brings the story to life, and really looking at it through their values, their beliefs, that historicism, and seeing it from that vantage point and keeping our modern viewpoints really away from it. I mean, geez, our sensibilities have changed so much in just 25 years on multiple topics that we cannot view yesterday through the lens of today. We really have to step back and step out of ourselves and see it for the qualities that they have. And it's funny because Roger was actually struggling with that in these chapters himself as a historian. He was struggling with what he brings to the table, knowing full well he brings virtually nothing to the table. And he was, putting that on Jemmy, but he really knows. He has very little to offer coming in with skills. Very little. Unlike his wife, who has lots of skills. They should be in the same position, but Frank prepared her. And interestingly, the Reverend did not prepare Roger. Though presumably, right, all the stuff that Frank told him that he would know, but how would he know that Roger was a traveler too? I mean, but he was a historian. This was his area of expertise as well. Looking at that time frame in Scotland. So he was really putting that cloak on Jemmy of telling him he's not good enough, where Roger really thinks he's not good enough. It's his burden to carry, knowing that he really is not good at any of it. Like zero. I mean, Roger could go work at a university, but really, what would he teach? He'd have to teach further back history. He certainly couldn't teach, modern, what's going on now. Because most of what he knows hasn't happened yet. It's in the process of occurring now, and they would think he was a witch or something. So really, what could Roger do? He's in a rough position, and now Jemmy puts him as a captain in his militia, right, his second, and he's going to help him find men and get all those commitments. That's going to be his job, right? And he's going to have to be away from Brianna. So Claire is really the only one that travels with the husband. Most of the wives stay behind, and as well as Brianna's tethered to the baby. The baby's only, 5 months old? So she can't be without the baby. Plus, she has valuable skills that the Ridge needs. She knows how to design and build things. And so she is actually a very good hunter. So she can really help make sure a lot of processes continue with Roger not being there and Jemmy not being there and Claire not being there. Now, they do need a backup healer while she's gone all the time. But that's how it goes. All right. So where do you find A Dram of Outlander? Well, of course, through all your streaming services, wherever you listen, through Apple Podcasts, through Spotify, through Google Play. And if you want to help the podcast, please take just a couple of minutes to go in and leave a review. Because I know if you go through iTunes for Apple Podcast, and for every 5-star review, it'll help people find the podcast and we'll have more listeners. I would love to continue to grow it as time goes on. You can find A Dram of Outlander on Facebook. There's the page, which I primarily post things and run. And then there's the Facebook group. It's a private group that you have to answer a few little questions to become part of. And it is continually growing, and it's an awesome group if you're on Facebook. There's very little drama. No, and really intelligent people who have amazing conversations. And another shout out to Patricia and Jan for being, co-admins and moderators and bringing a lot of quality conversation to the group. I cannot do it alone, and I so appreciate their efforts. It is tremendous. And on Instagram and Twitter, it's Drama of Outlander. And if you would like to financially support the podcast, I joyfully accept one-time offerings, but you can also go to patreon.com/thedramaofoutlander and do a monthly offering as little as $1 a month. And every buck counts because I have to keep up the website and the equipment, and there's behind-the-scenes things that go on to running the podcast. And so I appreciate every dollar as a solo podcaster and doing this out of my own free time. So thank you to all of you who have financially supported the podcast. If you are somebody in the fandom who creates Outlander-inspired products, if you would like to do a giveaway on the podcast, I am totally open to that. You can just send an email to contact@adramaofoutlander.com. Leave me a voicemail at 719-425-9444, and we can chat about it. And I also want your feedback, your comments, your thoughts, your questions to tell me I'm wrong. And again, use the same email, contact@adramaofoutlander.com, or voicemail at 719-425-9444. And I thank you for your patience this week. Midwifing, school, and life got in the way of the podcast, and it just got away from me this week. That is going to happen sometimes. I plan on doubling up, so we have 2 more podcasts done, so we'll be back on track by next Sunday. And as always, I thank you so much for listening, and I appreciate you following along and just keeping up. And I hope you have a fantastic week, and until next time, Slán je va.